Hello and welcome to the SEO Unplugged podcast. I'm your host, Itamar Blauer, and today I'm joined with Debbie Chu, who is the SEO specialist at Dialpad. Debbie, how are you doing?
I'm doing pretty good. How are you, Itamar?
Good. I'm doing great, thank you. Yeah, it's been a good day. And yeah, I mean this episode is super interesting because I think everyone's obsessed in the SEO industry about link building and they're always trying to I feel like one up each other. I don't know, that's something I see a lot.
Yes,
People like,
yes.
"Oh, like is this technique better than this one?" It's like, "Well, what can, it gets so saturated that it's like, what is something that you can confidently do that is going to guarantee results every time?" Like, that's the question on every person's mind who's doing link building. And you've got an awesome case to share where you've actually used an awesome way to get lots of links in a scalable way. And it's something that has achieved some great results. So I'm very much looking forward to getting a deep dive into that right now. So, but first of all, let's kind of think what does it mean, the words like data-led content? Like, how would you describe that in your own words?
Yeah. So, good question, of course. Um, I would describe it as uncovering new and interesting data points that we can package into like a piece of content and then push that content out there so that people can write about that and link to it. And so, if we take a few steps back, like let's say I'm a journalist or a writer, when would I naturally link to something in my article? So for me, that would be when I'm quoting like a research or a statistic. And so I'm using these data points to make my story more credible. And that's kind of where the strategy comes into play. So we're trying to create those interesting data for journalists, writers to cite.
And I think that's the key there, actually, because you got to think about it from who's the person that's going to want that data, or they're going to want to write about that. If you think of journalists, it's like, what do journalists always look for? They look for data, really, right? They always look
Exactly.
for new data because always that gives a different angle. And I think that's a really important thing to note there. So yeah, definitely thinking about it from the journalist's perspective, because data is what they want. But how have you sort of used this approach? What are some of the stuff that you've done with Dialpad to be able to create data-led content that has gotten you great success and lots of links?
Yeah. So at Dialpad, we recently just launched this state of video conferencing report. And basically, the whole idea behind it was that I wanted to shed light on one of our products, Dialpad Meetings, which is a tool for video conferencing. And so, there's a lot of big players out there for video conferencing, and I wanted to use this report as a way to show the world, like, hey, we have interesting information about meetings. We have our own product about meetings, and you should try out our product. And so that's kind of the thinking behind why we did this report. And then from there, like for a report, there's different types of data sets that you can use. For us, we used a combination of two. So one is our Dialpad proprietary data. So looking at meeting trends that we've seen before COVID and then after the pandemic. And so we looked at, okay, how has the number of meetings changed over time? How has that changed for different industries? And then also like the relation between people, how people name their meetings and how long those meetings are. So like for example, we found that stand-up meetings are actually one of the most time effective meetings that are on average like 13 minutes. And so these are kind of the things that we wanted to pull from our own data and share that in a piece of content, which was the report. And then we also did a survey. So we did our Delpad data, and then we also did a survey of over 3,000 US employees, kind of to learn more about their experience with video conferencing, what are their pain points, and things like that. And so from the survey data, we were able to find that our product actually matches a gap in the industry. So, for example, we asked everyone, like, what are some features you feel like are missing from your current video conferencing tool? And so, one of the top features that people mentioned was the ability to not have to download software in order to meet. And so, this was something that really aligned very well with Dialpad. And I was happy to see that so that we could highlight that in our piece of content. And when people see our report, they'll cover different tidbits of the report, and they might mention like, oh, we found that, or Dialpad found that a lot of people want to be able to have meetings without downloading software, and Dialpad is a solution for that.
Aha. So actually, that's really interesting because you've kind of killed two birds with one stone there. You've actually gone and done some research, gotten data, but at the same time, you were also able to sort of push users down the funnel into actually using your software and your services because you found that there was a gap. So it's actually like that's a really, I would say that's quite a difficult thing to do when you're doing this, like being able to get the data in there and be able to obviously pitch it out to journalists and get the story out there, but also to be able to bring in revenue for the business. But let's focus on the former part about the data that you've got. So let's say I'm in a small company and I want to be able to gather data, right? So what would be the easiest way to do that? Like access to proprietary data or collecting primary data on social media, for example, or even paying another company to do it? Like what do you think is the easiest way or the most effective way, which might not be the easiest way, to do
Yeah.
this if you're like a small business or you're an individual and you want to get started with this?
Yeah, so I would say there are pretty much like three main forms of sources that we can use. So the first one is the proprietary data. Of course, you have to usually work with a data scientist on your team to see like what data exists on within your company, and then kind of analyze and see if there's anything there. The second would be survey data. So you can, like you mentioned, like you can survey your customers on social media. You can send out like a full on survey with like 15, 30 questions to your customers. You can also buy like an audience panel to get the answers to find those interesting data insights to use in your content. And then the third one is actually using existing data sets. So, like, there's government census salary data. You could potentially use that in a way to tell an interesting story. Yeah.
Okay, that's interesting. And so what would be the, I assume the cheapest way of doing this is just going to your team, right? And saying like let's get, I want to get data on X, Y, and Z. Do we have that data? That would be, I assume that would be the easiest and cheapest way of doing it, right?
If you're a big company, then you can potentially survey, like, the employees at your company, but if you're a smaller company, I would say, yeah, if you have a data scientist that you can ask, then definitely go that route and see if there's interesting data, but it's possible that you might not find anything that's press worthy, and so the second choice I would say is doing a survey.
Okay, I see. And so what actually comes into that concept of data being newsworthy? Like what's the best way of determining, and I guess this actually comes right at the beginning. We kind of missed the step there where it's like, well, what should we initially do to think of what is actually newsworthy in terms of the kind of data that we should be collecting?
Yeah. So I would say the first thing would be, if you happen to have like a PR team or someone working in PR, definitely, work with them on day one for this project, because they are the ones who are the experts in figuring out like what is going to be press worthy, and then making sure that that's included in the story that you end up doing for your content. And so I think, going back to like the very beginning of working on this project, it's a lot about like brainstorming about, okay, what are the interesting data points that my target audience would want to know about? Is there any existing data that we can look into? Maybe it's outdated. Maybe we can do something new with those data points. And then those might be opportunities for us to maybe even reach out, like, hey, you're quoting something from like 1995, and we just did a report. Maybe you want to replace that stat with something that's more current. So those are just a few ways to approach the data and kind of think about it initially, because it is very important. The beginning steps of figuring out like what are you going to actually talk about, and then eventually, like, once you have those data points laid out, you do your survey or you gather your data, packaging that into a nice piece of content with a story that wraps everything up is also a very important piece of the puzzle.
Yeah, absolutely. And so the next thing that I want to deep dive into as well is how did you get, based off obviously having written that content, doing all this kind of work for it, how did you get the results that you did? Because I had a look and I saw that that particular piece that you wrote, it's got over 100 referring domains. You've got, follow links from the likes of Business Insider. I think was it Substack, one of them, or Namecheap, and
Yes,
you've
yes.
like these are very, 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 like, that's an understatement. Like, these are massive websites. So it's like, how did you go about them finding your content? Was this something that you proactively reached out to them, or did they come and find your content? I'm quite interested to hear about that.
Yeah, so actually one of our biggest wins was getting featured in Tech Republic, but unfortunately we didn't get a backlink, but we got like very good coverage of the report. And so through that, I think there was a bit of a trickle down effect. Like it would get syndicated through other publications. But the whole reason that we got that was because I worked closely with our PR team. So the PR team, they started pitching to different publications and journalists to get this report on their radar. And so even like before publishing the report, I would look at, okay, what are the existing reports? What backlinks do they have? Which of these are journalists? And then pass that over to the PR team and be like, hey, these people have talked about like similar reports or similar statistics before. We should reach out to them and see if they'd be interested in covering ours. And so that's kind of the process. And then aside from like the journalists outreach that the PR team does, like on my end also, like I reach out to blogs. So like for Namecheap, for example, like I had worked with them in the past and I wanted to mention like, oh, we have this cool report that we just published. It might be something that you might be interested in sharing with your audience if it's relevant. So it's like no pressure, but if it's something that you think might benefit your readers, feel free to link to it and share. And that's what they did. And I was really happy to see that.
Aha, wow, that's great. And I think that covers some very important things. So the first thing that kind of stood out to me is actually people who you have worked with in the past, maybe for other reasons. Like, you could still always go back to them because I guess you've already got that relationship, right? And then you're able to, use that relationship that you've built up, and you can get some new wins from that existing relationship you've got. But the other thing that's really interesting as well is even in the outreach, where it doesn't sound from what you're saying like it's a super duper complex, lengthy email that you send out,
Oh yeah, no,
but it's
definitely not.
like, and it just makes me think, it's like, well, at the end of the day, people value the content that it is. It's like, if you can go and send someone an email that's literally 2 or 3 lines, and they read that, first of all, it's easier to read, and then they go into the content and they're like, okay, yeah, this is good, this is something that we can use. Whereas I feel like in a lot of instances where people do this outreach, they're trying to build links to content that it doesn't match that kind of
Mm,
way of thinking for somebody, where it's like, and this is the whole concept of why we're talking about, data-led content for link building, because at the end of the day, data is essentially what most people or most journalists or newspapers, like, that's what they cite to get new stories. And you see that a lot. And I feel like the thing that you touched upon earlier about seeing what's already out there, I think that's fantastic, because anyone can basically go in and look for statistics around your industry, see what other people have done already, and find gaps in it. So if something's outdated,
exactly.
you can go do it, get a more recent version of it, even if like the sample size, or even if if you might think that you can't do it to the same scale as somebody else, but at least having kind of fresh data is always going to put you at an advantage. And I feel like that's the kind of key here. I think it's the proactivity of kind of understanding where the gaps are and utilizing your resources to be able to create content that is 100% led on data that you can gather. And I think that's a really important thing. But I wonder, Debbie, like, in this kind of process and in this experience of yours, what did you find to be like the hardest part of this whole thing?
Hmm. Let's see. I think one big thing that I learned when working on this is sometimes like you might when you work on a project with like different stakeholders and with across different teams, it's easy to assume that like people know exactly what you want unless you explicitly tell them what you want. So like let's say we're working on a graphic and then in my mind I'm thinking like, okay, we have the title here and then we should have a link here and then the chart should be like this big, something like that. And then if I don't communicate that over, people might kind of do their own version and then we start doing like a back and forth. Like, oh, I thought you know, I wanted it this way. And then it's like, oh, I needed more direction. And so that was something for me to like really keep in mind going forward. Like, you don't need to feel like you are like micromanaging someone, but it's more of like, okay, making sure that you both are aligned on like how exactly should this piece of content look like? How do we make sure that the data stands out properly? And let's say if someone shares a piece of like, let's say someone shares a chart, we want to make sure that they can somehow find our report in case it was like shared on social media without like the proper attribution. And so I think that was something big in terms of like what I learned. One of the things that I really had to understand when working on this project. There was a lot of different things, and I think as you work on more reports, like even though this was not my first one, you learn a lot of about how to make them better next time. I think another thing is also just when before you hit publish, uh, for something like a data-led content, you want to make sure that nothing is actually guaranteed. So it is very possible that you get coverage, or worst case, you might not get any coverage. And and you might also get coverage the day of the launch of your content. It might take days, it might take weeks to come through. So when you work on a project like this, the work doesn't really end right after the report is finished. It's a lot of outreach before the report, even after the report, and also keeping an eye out for like any unlinked mentions of your report, or those are just opportunities for you to reach out and say like, hey, thanks for mentioning our report on video conferencing. I noticed you didn't link to our report, and I think it would be really helpful if you do. Or there might be instances where people link to your homepage instead of the piece of content, and so reaching out and then letting them know like it'd be great if you could link directly to the piece of content so that people can get there without getting lost on the homepage or something like that. So I think those were my biggest takeaways.
Yeah, that's really really important. I think so, and the point that you mentioned just there about the work doesn't really stop once you've kind of published that content. You've got to keep going, keep being proactive, doing the outreach. And even though like say for example, unlinked mention, you mentioned that TechCrunch they didn't link to the report, but that still got trickled down, and other people managed to cover it as well. So there's still even benefits sometimes of just getting that coverage, even though that kind of goes against maybe initially what we might think link building, because like, well, they didn't link to us, but it led to maybe potentially dozens of other sites linking to it as well that are
Exactly.
also still very relevant. And the point that you mentioned, the first one as well, about being like specific about what it is that you want, that can be really helpful as well, even if you're doing this by yourself. So say for example you've got an idea, and let's say you're not a developer and you still need somebody to help you. Let's say you're trying to build a calculator, because the calculators are also like very very fun, very data
Yes.
based. So it's like, even with that, like getting a really clear and concise instructions of what you want, and then going somewhere like Upwork and getting some developer to build it
Hmm.
based on like very specific kind of instructions that you've set, and then you could just like use iframe embeds and then get that on your content. So it's like there shouldn't really be anything stopping you. I guess it all sounds like anyone can kind of do this. Am I right in saying that?
Yeah, I think definitely as long as you figure out like, okay, what are the interesting data points? What are the things that we want journalists to write about? And then kind of go from there and figure out, okay, how are we going to get that data? Are we going to survey our customers? Are we going to survey other people? Or like, how do we get that data? And then piecing that together and then doing the outreach. It's really like these three like main steps. And so it's a matter of like doing this and kind of refining your processes as you get more experience with creating data led content.
Amazing. You've summed it up brilliantly there. I think that pretty much wraps it up. Debbie, where can people find you on the web if they want to hear more about what it is that you're doing?
Yeah, I think the best place to find me is on Twitter. So just Deb, JustDeBBB. That would be my Twitter handle. And then I love sharing about link building and SEO and content. So I'll definitely follow me on there, and we can have more conversations about how can we create data-led content and other link building tactics.
Amazing. Debbie, thank you so much for joining me on the SEO Unplugged podcast. And thanks for all the viewers as well. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hey, you've reached the end of this video, but don't worry, there's plenty more great content that you can watch right now. All you have to do is click one of the 2 video links on the left side of the screen. And also, if you haven't already, make sure to subscribe and turn on the notification bell to never miss out on future uploads.